it's focused on clustering to promote innovation. So if you think about, your Canadian colleague, Pierre de Rocher, he talks a lot about the issues of what's wrong with efforts at clustering, government-managed clustering. What you're looking at is how it is that you coordinate the comparative advantages within the supply chain as in its impact. At least that's how I read it. And so I would have expected in your empirical evidence, given the shifts in the changes, I would have expected more distortions in the economy than you actually show. I would expect sort of weird things. This maybe demonstrates my priors, but in the U.S., if we did it, we'd be growing oranges in Maine, and trying to produce wine in Virginia or something like that, because government decided to manage the supply and decide how to, do this. And so we should expect to see more of the internal division of labor somehow distorted than what you're picking up. Given this shift in the notions of what these environmental externalities are. Or to put it another way, the dispute within policy would be, how through sort of minimal interventions by government or shifts in law, you can, affect the supply chain, but still as its grounds of economic efficiency is still governing it, right? But since they don't have access to, given even your model, like as you point out, I think it's on page, I have it down here as page 172, and my printout, you point out that these prices are not really exchange ratios on the market, they're model prices, right? Yeah. And so they're not really like the prices that would reflect the subjective trade-offs that individuals face. I mean, so if you think about your own market process analysis of comparative advantage, what you're relying on is the subjective assessment of trade-offs that exist in individual heterogeneous agents' heads. Gets communicated through the price ratios into objective knowledge that others can utilize in their subjective trade-offs, right? And if somehow we stop having that trade-off of those prices guiding this thing, then the pattern is going to get shifted in a way which we don't necessarily expect it to be consistent with the earlier pattern. And if you look at if I understand your data right, what you've seen is you haven't had a morphing of the pattern. You've actually had the pattern sort of, reinforced at some level, right, rather than a shift. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding something there. But so why is it that we don't see since they don't have access to direct economic knowledge, that the decisions are more based on political lobbying issues, which they do have access to, and that should then generate more distortions. So why is the Canadian egg market as rational, right, as it seems, given this shift in the pattern of policy? Okay. So those are my two questions. Grafting disequilibrium economics on top of an equilibrium model, and yet coming up with equilibrium, basically efficiency results. How comfortable are you with that? And then the second one is, why don't we see more distortions given the opportunity for superfluous discoveries and misleading and rent seeking and whatnot, that the introduction of this as opposed to the price system guiding these things has been introduced?
Okay. For the first question, how comfortable I am using equilibrium theory in some sort of a disequilibrium context. Well, I think it's a challenge because I continually use two lines of reasoning. On one side, I have the general equilibrium framework, but I also maintain some qualifying attributes of the process. So I always have to keep in check that what the equilibrium theory is saying should not be interpreted literally as it is in the model. So, for example, in my model where people specialize first in 2, then in 3 different goods, they observe market prices, Now, in the general equilibrium model, we don't really say where these prices are coming from. They're coming from me through the iterative calculation in my spreadsheet. But these people are taking these prices as given and then decide their specialization decisions. So this is not actually, if we take this literally, it's hard to link this to the actual market, how the actual market works, where we have more sort of a decentralized appearance of more than one price at the same time, where there is sort of, I see it sort of as a pulsating organism continuously feeding information from different parts into each other. So, for example, in the model I have the implicit assumptions that individuals instantaneously correct their errors without penalty, without some mistakes. For example, if they think the market price is one price, but it's not really going to be the price that's going to clear the market, if they all specialize in one group of individuals in food, the other, say, in clothing, and then when they end up seeing that this is not actually what's going to, the supply is not going to meet the demand, they instantaneously in the model revert and recalculate and respecialize into new things. So it's again the language, the general equilibrium method introduces some of its own constraints on the way we can formalize and represent things. So yeah, I agree. When I did this model, I continuously, together with developing the equilibrium model, on the side we're listing some of its characteristics that are what their implications would be if they're taken literally, and how these things could be understood in the actual market. So how comfortable? I would say I use the general equilibrium framework to illustrate some of the ideas that don't necessarily come out of this theory, but to illustrate these ideas. For example, I have in one part quota exchange as an adaptation to changes in individual comparative advantage. Just saying that to someone wouldn't really be clear what I mean, especially when people are used to analyzing things in this framework. So then I say, well, let's frame it this way, and let's look at it this way, and let's see what we can, what are these missing time and place specific elements of knowledge? How can we represent them in this form so we can maybe see them easier? So I see it as a, let's say, juggling process in that sense. In the other case, why the Canadian dairy industry is not as you said, more distorted than it really is. Well, one thing we could look at in the beginning, let's see the slides. We could look at, for example, this. So this would be a good, or let me see, the slide where we have on one side the interprovincial shifts in production allocation, and then,
yeah, I got it.
Yeah. So this is sort of could be used to see some of the reflections of rigidity of the system. So the system is more flexible within provinces. We have individuals holding their, say, quota licenses, and if they want to increase their output, they need to buy quota from another individual. So there, at least in that sense, they have some freedom in figuring out people who want to exit the industry or reduce output. They have some freedom to decide based on their evaluation of alternative uses of resources based on what the price is to do so. And also, people who want to increase their production can do it the same. So here we have sort of a market-like structure within the system. There is some exchange of licenses to produce, and this exchange would tend to go to people who are willing to pay a higher price, which would then reflect some of their
underlying preference. Yes.
Yes. Now, here, if we look at interprovincial allocations, this is, so we have Canadian Milk Supply Management Committee, which sits every year and then decides, okay, we're going to increase national production by this many units. And national production increases gradually to meet increasing demand. So how are we going to allocate? The decision there is made. How much is it going to be allocated to different provinces? And that's where they need the information about, say, relative trade-offs and subjective trade-offs to different individuals in these provinces. And we can see that things are not changing that much. So across provinces, things are not changing that much. So it's almost like what the state of things was in 1972 when this system was introduced. It looks like it just the provincial shares remain the same since then. So it's sort of inertia there. So I'm not sure how well I answered that question.
No, that's fine. We'll come back to that some,
okay.
I think. But yeah, I'm willing to pass on to the next person.
Okay.
You got to push the button. There we go.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Getu?
Thanks, Predrag. I have a couple of questions for the first round. And my first questions are actually very broad, related to the idea of comparative advantage. So we start with comparative advantage for individuals or firms or others. I would say it's based on differences in productivity. Now that led to what you're talking about, the lack of consensus in supply-managed or regulated industry. But I don't know if there's the same lack of consensus in non-supply managed industry. I want you to comment on that first, in terms of the presence of a lack of consensus in the two, and why. That's my first question. And then the next question leads to this environmental policy, around environmental policy, where you're saying, just showed in the graph earlier, there's a shift in production structure due to environmental policy. I kind of have a concern there because there are a lot of policies going around, for example, starting in 1996, etc. Particularly if you look at the prairie region, we have what we call the removal of the PRORATE, or the Western Grain Transportation Act, which actually shifts the cost of feed, etc. And you see that actually in areas where there's a huge shift in, say, Manitoba or Alberta or those regions. And I'm just wondering, from an empirical point of view, how you could disentangle actually the effect of those support program, renewable support program, from the environmental, and how comfortable are you in the conclusion that environmental pressure has led to change in comparative advantage?
Okay. Those two questions?
Yeah, I'll have more about it.
Okay, so first is why is there a lack of consensus in supply managed industries how to implement comparative advantage, but not in non-supply managed? I think the basic problem starts with the actual system of supply management, which puts certain constraints of market transactions. And what we want to, what the basic aim